The first thing I noticed was her shoes. They were black, polished, and too familiar, standing beside my husband at my mother's funeral like they had every right to be there. For a moment, I thought grief was playing tricks on me. The chapel smelled of lilies and old wood, the kind of smell that settles into your clothes and refuses to leave. My ears rung with the low murmur of condolences, the soft shuffle of feet, the coughs people make when they don't know what to say. I had been nodding, banking, accepting hugs I barely felt. Then I looked up, and there she was. Not behind him, not a few rows back. Beside him, close enough that her arm brushed his sleeve, close enough that she leaned in when he whispered something, and she smiled like she belonged to him. Something inside me went very still. I didn't cry, I didn't gasp, I didn't ask a single question. I just stood there, my hands folded in front of my black dress, listening to the slow thud of my own heart as it changed its rhythm. That was the moment I stopped being only a grieving daughter and became something else entirely. I remember thinking, so this is how he chose to show me. My mother's casket rested at the front of the chapel, closed and quiet. She would have hated all this fuss, the flowers, the whispers, the way people tried to soften the truth of death with pretty words. Don't sugarcoat pain, she used to tell me. It rots the teeth. I wondered what she would have said if she'd seen my husband standing there with another woman while her body lay 10 feet away. The minister cleared his throat. Someone touched my elbow, asking if I needed to sit. I shook my head without looking. My eyes were locked on that woman's profile, the careful makeup, the practiced sadness, the way she scanned the room as if she were being seen. She knew where she was, and she still came. Before that day, my life had been ordinary in the quiet, dependable way I once believed was enough. My mother, Ruth, lived 10 minutes away in the same neighborhood she'd raised me in. I visited every Sunday with a loaf of bread or a container of soup, even when she insisted she was just fine. She wasn't fine, not really, not after the diagnosis, but she was proud. She liked her routines: morning radio, afternoon crossword, evenings with the window cracked open so she could hear the neighborhood settling down. My husband Daniel had always said he admired her strength. He called her ma'am even after 15 years of marriage, a habit she pretended to scold him for while secretly enjoying it. We had a rhythm, the three of us. It wasn't perfect, but it was steady. Daniel and I met young. We built our life brick by brick. Small house, shared bills, long talks at the kitchen table after work. He worked in logistics, long hours and constant phone calls. I worked at a local office, the kind of job where people brought donuts on Fridays and complained about the copier. We didn't have children, something I used to grieve quietly, then learn to live with. My mother filled some of that space without even trying. If you'd asked me a year ago whether I trusted my husband, I would have said yes without thinking. Trust to me wasn't fireworks or passion. It was knowing who would take out the trash, who remembered to lock the door, who sat beside you when the doctor cleared his throat before speaking. But things had changed so gradually I didn't recognize them as changes at first. Daniel had become distracted. Not cruel, not distant in an obvious way, just less present, like a man whose body is in the room while his thoughts are somewhere else entirely. He checked his phone more often, took calls in the garage, said work was intense right now, in that vague tone that discouraged questions. I told myself not to be suspicious. My mother was sick. My energy was split in too many directions. Not everything meant something. Then came the nights he didn't come home on time. Not missing nights, just late ones. Traffic, he'd say, or we had to reroute a shipment. His excuses were smooth, well-practiced, and he never forgot to ask how my mother was doing. Sometimes he even brought flowers for her, setting them on her kitchen table with a careful smile. Looking back, I realize now how much effort he put into looking like a good man. The day my mother died, the world narrowed to a single phone call. I was standing in my kitchen, the kettle screaming on the stove, when the hospital number lit up my screen. I knew before I answered. Some truths announce themselves in the body before they reach the mind. My knees went weak, my mouth went dry. Daniel was in the shower. I didn't call for him. I took the call alone. After, I sat at the table for a long time, staring at the wood grain like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. When Daniel came out, towel around his waist, he knew by my face. He pulled me into his arms, and I let myself cry into his chest. I believed then that grief would bring us closer. I believed wrong. The days that followed blurred together. Paperwork, phone calls, casseroles left at the door. Daniel handled the logistics, or so he said. He volunteered to contact the funeral home. You shouldn't have to deal with this, he told me, brushing my hair back gently. I was grateful, exhausted, hollowed out. I didn't attend every planning meeting. I trusted him to stand in for me. After all, he was my husband. So when I walked into that chapel and saw her beside him, smiling softly as if she were part of the family, it wasn't just betrayal I felt. It was realization. This hadn't been an accident. It had been arranged. The service began. The minister spoke about my mother's kindness, her stubborn love, the way she showed up even when it was hard. I listened with half an ear, my attention split between memories of my mother's laugh and the quiet, terrible clarity forming in my mind. Daniel never looked at me. Not once. His eyes stayed forward. His hand brushed that woman's fingers, then settled back at his side as if nothing unusual was happening. I understood then that this was not a lapse in judgment born of grief. This was confidence. This was a man who believed he could bring his other life into mine, and I would be too broken to stop him. I felt something hardened in my chest. Grief, yes, but also resolve. I didn't know yet what I would do. I only knew what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't fall apart in public. I wouldn't beg, and I wouldn't forget. As the first hymn began, I lowered myself into the pew, my spine straight, my face calm. I folded my hands and stared ahead at my mother's casket, silently making her a promise. I see everything now, I thought, and I will handle it my way.
The days after the funeral passed like I was walking through water, slow, heavy, resistant. People assume grief arrives loudly, all sobs and collapsed bodies. For me, it arrived quietly. It sat in my chest and pressed down, making every breath deliberate. Daniel drove us home from the cemetery in silence. The woman, her, had left shortly after the service, slipping out before condolences turned into conversations. No one stopped her. No one questioned why she had been there. That, somehow, hurt more than if someone had asked. At home, Daniel loosened his tie and hung it carefully on the back of a chair. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed the hardest part of the day was over. "I'm going to make some tea," he said gently, as if nothing unusual had occurred. I watched him from the doorway. The kitchen light made a halo on the counter, illuminating crumbs I hadn't had the energy to wipe away. The kettle filled with water, the stove clicked on. Normal sounds, domestic sounds, the kind that used to reassure me. I waited. If you've ever truly loved someone, you know that moment, the pause where you give them one last chance to tell the truth without being asked. I gave Daniel that chance. He didn't take it. Instead, he set a mug in front of me and rested his hand on my shoulder. "Today was hard," he said. "You were very strong." Strong. The word landed wrong. Strength implied endurance without resistance. I didn't want to endure this. I wanted to understand it. "Who was the woman at the funeral?" I asked. My voice didn't shake. I was proud of that. Daniel's hand stilled for just a second, barely a breath, but it was enough. Then he sighed and sat across from me, folding his hands like a man preparing for a reasonable discussion. "She's someone from work," he said. "She heard about your mother and wanted to pay respects." I nodded slowly, as if considering this. "You stood beside her, not behind, not in the back." Daniel smiled, the tight kind that never reached his eyes. "You're reading too much into it. Today was emotional." There it was, the quiet dismissal, the implication that grief had made me unreliable. I let it go, not because I believed him, but because I wanted him comfortable. Men who think they've explained something away become careless. I had learned that from my mother, who believed observation was the strongest form of preparation. That night, Daniel slept easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned in lazy circles, listening to his breathing even out. I thought about my mother's voice, the way she always said, "When something doesn't make sense, it's because you're missing a piece, not because you're foolish." I resolved to find the missing piece. Grief gave me cover. People expect you to be distracted after a loss, forgetful, withdrawn. I leaned into that expectation. I missed calls, let messages go unanswered, told friends I needed space. Daniel interpreted my quiet as weakness. In truth, I was watching. He took more phone calls outside. His schedule became unpredictable in ways it never had before. He stopped leaving his phone face up on the counter. Passwords changed, notifications silenced. Still, he played his role well. He asked if I'd eaten, he reminded me to rest, he told people how worried he was about me. What he didn't know was that grief sharpens some senses. I noticed the unfamiliar perfume on his jacket one evening, something floral and sweet that wasn't mine. I noticed receipts tucked deep into his wallet, places he claimed he'd never been. I noticed how his voice softened when certain numbers appeared on his screen, and I remembered the woman at the funeral. Her posture, her certainty, the way she hadn't looked around nervously like someone out of place. She had stood there like she belonged. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after my mother's burial, I drove to her house. I hadn't been back since the funeral. The lawn was still trimmed, Daniel had arranged for that, but the house felt hollow without her. I walked through each room slowly, touching familiar objects. Her armchair, the chipped mug she always used, the drawer where she kept important papers neatly labeled in her careful handwriting. That was where I found the envelope. It wasn't hidden. My mother didn't hide things. She prepared. Inside were copies of bank statements, insurance documents, and a single folded note addressed to me. "If you're reading this," it began, "something has already gone wrong." My throat tightened as I read. She wrote about trust, about watching people over time, about how sometimes the greatest betrayals come disguised as kindness. She didn't name Daniel, but she didn't need to. At the bottom, she'd written one last line: "Don't rush your pain. Let it show you what you need to see." I sat on the floor and cried then, not loudly, but deeply, the kind of crying that empties something out of you so something else can move in. Clarity moved in. The next piece came accidentally. Daniel asked me to forward him an email from his work laptop. He'd left it at home that day, claiming an urgent meeting had pulled him out too quickly. I opened the laptop on the dining table. The email was easy to find. Before closing it, I noticed another tab open, calendar entries synced across devices. One entry caught my eye. L. Dinner. No surname, no location, just a heart emoji beside it. I didn't click anything else. I closed the laptop carefully and sent the email. That night, I said nothing. Instead, I asked a question that sounded harmless. "Did you ever meet anyone special through work?" Daniel laughed lightly. "Special how?" "I don't know," I said, stirring my food. "People you talk to often?" He shrugged. "Just colleagues." The lie was smooth, practiced. It slid off his tongue without resistance. I smiled and nodded. Inside, the pieces were aligning. The woman at the funeral, the perfume, the calendar, the way he'd taken control of arrangements I should have been part of. He hadn't brought her there impulsively. He'd brought her because he thought grief had made me invisible. He was wrong. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't planning to confront him in a moment of anger. I wasn't going to scream or cry or beg for explanations that would only be half true. I was going to wait. And in that waiting, I was going to let him reveal exactly who he was. By the time Daniel noticed I had stopped asking questions altogether, it was already too late. Silence can be a powerful thing when the other person expects noise. Daniel noticed my quiet after about a week. At first, he mistook it for progress, grief settling into something manageable. He told people I was doing better. He smiled more, whistled sometimes when he thought I wasn't listening. The house filled again with the small sounds of routine, and he took that as permission. What he didn't know was that I was cataloging everything. I learned the rhythm of his absences. Tuesdays and Thursdays were late nights. Sundays, he suddenly needed to clear his head after lunch. He showered immediately when he came home on those days, scrubbing his skin like he was trying to erase something. I noticed how he hummed while shaving, a tune I'd never heard before, as if another life had given him new music. I started taking walks in the evenings. It gave me a reason to be out without explanation, and it gave me time to think. Our neighborhood had always been quiet, the kind of place where porch lights flicked on at dusk and dogs barked lazily behind fences. As I walked, I thought about my mother's note, "Don't rush your pain." So I didn't. One afternoon, Daniel left his phone on the kitchen counter while he took a call in the garage. I wasn't looking for it, truly, but it lit up with a message, and the name caught my eye. Lena, Hart. There was no mistaking it now. The message preview was short. "Miss you already. Today was perfect." I stared at the screen until it dimmed, my reflection staring back at me like a stranger. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't read further. I didn't need to. The confirmation hurt more than I expected. Not sharp pain, but a deep, bruising ache. 15 years compressed into a single truth. My husband had built a parallel life, and he was careless enough to bring it into the one I was still standing in. That night, I dreamed of my mother. She was standing in her kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, looking at me the way she did when she already knew the answer. She didn't speak, she just nodded once, slow and sure. I woke up with my decision made. I needed to see her again. Not to confront her, not yet. I needed to understand who she was, what kind of woman could stand at a stranger's funeral and smile like she belonged there. It didn't take much effort. Lena wasn't as careful as Daniel. A name, a workplace, and a few hours online gave me enough. She worked in marketing for a regional firm, lived in an apartment complex across town, liked yoga and artisanal coffee. She posted often, carefully curated happiness, soft lighting, captions about peace and alignment. There was a photo from the week of my mother's funeral. A black dress, the same one. The caption read, "Supporting someone you love through loss puts everything into perspective." I closed the app and sat very still. Something settled in me then. Not rage, not hysteria. Resolve. Cold and clear. Daniel came home that evening with flowers, yellow roses, my mother's favorite. He handed them to me with a gentle smile. "I thought you might like these," he said. I took them, inhaled their faint scent, and thanked him. He mistook my composure for forgiveness he hadn't earned. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Daniel's company announced a small memorial charity event a month after my mother's passing, something about community outreach. He mentioned it casually over dinner, not realizing the significance of what he was offering. "Spouses are invited, if you're up to it." I looked at him across the table. His face was open, expectant. I wondered if he imagined bringing both of us or if he assumed Lena would sit this one out. "I'd like that," I said softly. His relief was immediate. In the days leading up to the event, I prepared quietly. I updated paperwork, gathered copies of bank statements, insurance policies, anything with both our names on it. I met with a lawyer under the guise of estate planning, another benefit of grief. People don't ask too many questions. The lawyer listened without interruption as I explained. She didn't look surprised. She just nodded and said, "You're doing the right thing by staying calm." Calm, that word again. At home, Daniel was more attentive than he'd been in months. He asked my opinion on his suit. He held my hand in public. He even suggested we take a weekend trip soon, just to reconnect. I agreed to everything. Because the truth was, I wasn't planning to reconnect. I was planning to reveal. The night of the event, I dressed carefully.
Nothing dramatic, simple black dress, pearl earrings, my mother's. I wanted to look like myself, grounded, respectable, impossible to dismiss. When we arrived, the room buzzed with polite conversation and clinking glasses. Daniel guided me through introductions, his hand warm at my back. Then I saw her. Lena stood near the bar laughing with a group of colleagues. She wore a red dress this time, confident and bright. When she noticed Daniel, her face lit up, then froze. Her eyes flicked to me. Recognition passed over her face like a shadow. Daniel felt it too. His hand tightened at my back. "I need to say hello to someone," he murmured, already pulling away. "I'll come with you." The three of us stood there, the space between us charged and quiet. Lena recovered first. She extended her hand to me, smile practiced. "You must be Daniel's wife. I'm Lena." I took her hand. It was warm, steady. "I know," I said gently. "We met at my mother's funeral." The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. Lena's smile faltered. People around us continued chatting, unaware that a marriage was cracking open in real time. "I didn't realize you were still married," Lena said, her voice tight. I looked at Daniel then, really looked at him, the man who had stood beside another woman while my mother was laid to rest. "Oh, we are. For now," I said. Daniel's face drained of color. I excused myself politely and walked away, my heart pounding but my steps steady. I didn't stay for the fallout. I didn't need to. What I needed was already set in motion. That night, Daniel didn't come home. I packed a small bag and slept in the guest room, the house quiet around me. For the first time since my mother died, I slept deeply. The truth was no longer mine alone, and soon, neither would be the consequences.
Daniel came home just before dawn. I heard the front door open softly, then close again, the careful movements of someone hoping not to be noticed. I didn't move. The guest room was dark, the curtains drawn, my overnight bag resting by the door like a quiet declaration. He stood there for a moment. I could feel it, that familiar pause where he gathered his thoughts before speaking. When he finally did, his voice was low, strained. "We need to talk." I sat up slowly and turned on the bedside lamp. Light filled the room, exposing the truth on his face, exhaustion, fear, and something else he'd never shown me before, uncertainty. "Yes," I said calmly, "we do." He tried first with apology, then explanation, then justification. He spoke about loneliness, about pressure, about how it just happened. He talked as if words could smooth the sharp edges of what he'd done. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he waited. He always did. He was used to me responding, soothing, forgiving, trying to make sense of the senseless. Instead, I asked one question. "Why did you bring her to my mother's funeral?" The room went very quiet. Daniel swallowed. "I didn't think—" "That's not an answer," I said. My voice didn't rise. "You planned it. You arranged it. You stood beside her while my mother was laid to rest." He sank into the chair by the window, rubbing his face with both hands. "She wanted to support me." "No," I said. "You wanted to normalize her presence in my life. You thought if you did it while I was grieving, I wouldn't fight back." The truth landed between us, heavy and undeniable. He didn't deny it. "He made a mistake," he said finally. "No," I replied. "You made a series of choices." The next few weeks were administrative in the way heartbreak often is when you refuse to dramatize it. Lawyers, bank accounts, schedules, conversations that stayed strictly factual. Daniel moved out. Lena, as it turned out, hadn't known the full truth either. He'd told her our marriage was basically over. When she realized it wasn't, she ended things publicly and decisively. People talk when that happens.
Daniel's colleagues whispered, family members called, unsure whose side they were on. Some told me I should try to forgive him, for the sake of time invested, for the sake of appearances. I thought of my mother's note again, "Don't rush your pain," so I didn't rush forgiveness either. What surprised me most was not the betrayal, but the relief that followed clarity. There was no more guessing, no more watching. The worst thing had already happened, and I was still standing. At the divorce mediation, Daniel looked smaller somehow. He tried one last time to appeal to memory, to history. "We were happy," he said quietly. "Yes," I agreed, "we were. And then you decided happiness wasn't enough unless it was hidden." That ended the discussion. The public consequences unfolded without spectacle, but they were real. Daniel's reputation suffered, not because of gossip, but because patterns were revealed. People noticed the overlap of timelines, the inconsistencies. Trust, once questioned, rarely recovers fully. I attended the final hearing alone. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun and felt something close to peace for the first time in months. That evening, I went to my mother's house again. I packed slowly this time, deciding what to keep and what to let go. In the back of her closet, I found a small box labeled "Letters." Inside were notes she'd written to me over the years, birthdays, holidays, moments she didn't know how to say out loud. One letter was dated only weeks before she died. "You are stronger than you think," it read. "Not because you endure, but because you choose yourself when it matters." I sat on the floor and let those words settle into me. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. In mornings where I drank my coffee without rushing, in evenings where the house felt quiet but not lonely, in conversations with friends who didn't ask me to explain myself. I planted a small garden in my backyard, something my mother had always wanted to do but never had the energy for. I chose flowers she loved, yellow roses among them. Sometimes I still think about the funeral, about the moment I saw them standing together. It no longer hurts the way it did. Now it feels like a line in my life, a clear before and after. Before, I trusted without question. After, I trusted myself. Grief taught me many things. Betrayal taught me more. I learned that dignity doesn't require silence, but it does require patience. That revenge doesn't have to be loud to be effective. That the strongest response is often the one that lets truth speak for itself. And I learned that love, real love, does not hide in shadows or arrive uninvited at sacred moments. It stands beside you openly, even in grief.
After the divorce papers were signed and filed, life didn't suddenly become lighter. It became quieter. There's a difference. The quiet wasn't empty at first. It was filled with echoes. Daniel's footsteps in the hallway that no longer came, the creak of the cabinet he always forgot to close, the low hum of his voice when he talked in his sleep. I noticed those absences the way you notice a missing tooth with your tongue, constantly, unconsciously. But absence, I learned, is not the same thing as loss. Some things need to leave in order for you to breathe again. I stayed in the house. People asked why. They assumed it would hold too many memories, too much pain. What they didn't understand was that the house wasn't the problem. The silence inside it had already existed long before Daniel moved out. I was just hearing it clearly now. I rearranged the furniture one Saturday morning, pushing the couch toward the window, clearing space where heaviness used to sit. I donated clothes that no longer felt like mine. I threw away mugs chipped by careless hands. Each small decision felt like reclaiming territory. Daniel tried to contact me a few times after everything was finalized. At first, it was practical, documents he forgot, questions he already knew the answers to. Then it turned personal. "I miss you," he said once, standing on the porch with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I looked at him through the screen door. He seemed older, not wiser, just worn. "I don't," I said gently. "I miss who I thought you were." He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer, and walked away without another word. That was the last time we spoke. Lena reached out to me only once. Her message was long, carefully written, full of apologies that didn't ask for forgiveness but hoped for it anyway. She told me she hadn't known about my mother, that if she had, she never would have gone. I believed her, but belief doesn't always lead to reconciliation. I replied simply, "I hope you learn to question what feels convenient. Take care." Then I blocked the number, not out of anger, out of closure. As weeks turned into months, grief changed shape. It softened around the edges. It came in waves instead of storms. Some days I could walk past my mother's old house without stopping. Other days I found myself parked outside, remembering how she used to stand at the window and wave even after I'd driven halfway down the street. I took the letters I'd found and read one each Sunday morning, treating them like conversations instead of relics. In one, she wrote about her own marriage, about compromises she regretted and the ones she didn't. "Love should never make you smaller," she wrote. "If it does, ask yourself who benefits from that." I carried that sentence with me. People often expect healing to look dramatic, a new love, a bold transformation, a visible triumph. Mine was quieter. I joined a community book club. I volunteered twice a week at a local center that helped widows navigate paperwork and loneliness. I learned how to enjoy my own company without filling every silence. One afternoon, while tending the garden, I realized something had changed. I wasn't angry anymore. Not numb, not resigned. Free. The memory of the funeral returned to me then, not as a wound, but as a marker, a moment when everything I thought I knew cracked open and showed me the truth beneath. Daniel hadn't destroyed me. He'd revealed me. The woman who could stand in the middle of unbearable grief and still choose dignity. The woman who didn't need to scream to be heard. The woman who understood that justice doesn't always come with applause, but it comes all the same. I visited my mother's grave on the anniversary of her death. I brought fresh flowers and sat on the cool grass, telling her about the garden, the quiet mornings, the way life had slowly stitched itself back together. I thanked her for the lessons she'd given me, some directly, some through pain. Before I left, I said out loud, "I'm okay." And for the first time, I meant it. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's this. Grief does not make you weak. Betrayal does not make you foolish. And choosing yourself does not make you cruel. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to collapse when someone expects you to. Sometimes the bravest revenge is a life lived honestly without them.
There was a strange thing that happened once the dust settled. People stopped asking how I was doing and started watching how I was living. At the grocery store, neighbors tilted their heads when they spoke to me, like they were studying a photograph that had changed when no one was looking. Some smiled with sympathy, others with curiosity. A few avoided me altogether, unsure which side of the story I represented now. I didn't mind. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't performing stability for anyone. I had earned my quiet. Daniel's absence created space, not just physical space, but mental space. I noticed how often I'd been bracing myself before conversations, how many of my thoughts had once been filtered through the question, how will he take this? Without him, my thoughts moved freely. One evening, as I sat on the back porch watching the sky darken into deep blue, I realized something unsettling. I had been lonely inside my marriage long before it ended. The affair hadn't created that loneliness, it had only exposed it. That realization didn't absolve him, but it reframed my grief. I wasn't mourning the marriage I lost, I was mourning the years I'd spent shrinking to keep it intact. Daniel's family reached out eventually. His sister called first.
She spoke carefully, as if walking through glass. "I didn't know," she said, "about any of it." "I know," I replied. She hesitated. "He's not doing well." I believed her. Men like Daniel often confuse being wanted with being whole. Once the illusion collapses, there's nothing underneath but noise. "I hope he finds help," I said honestly. And I meant it, without wanting him back. That surprised me most of all. The woman at the funeral, Lena, faded from my thoughts faster than I expected. She had been a symbol, not a root. The real betrayal hadn't been the affair. It had been the audacity, the decision to stand beside another woman while my mother lay silent at the front of the chapel. The assumption that grief would make me pliable, that sorrow would rob me of clarity. What he never understood was that grief had sharpened me. Loss stripped away distraction. It showed me exactly where dignity lived. One afternoon, months later, I found myself cleaning out the last remaining box from my mother's house. Inside was a photo album I hadn't seen before. Old, leather-bound, the corners soft with age. Inside were pictures of her younger self, not just as my mother, but as a woman, laughing at a picnic, standing alone on a beach, hair whipped by wind, sitting at a table with a book, eyes focused, unbothered. I stared at one picture for a long time. She looked peaceful, not because life had been easy, but because she had chosen herself often enough to recognize who she was. I understood then that part of my grief had been fear that without my husband, without my mother, without the roles I had inhabited for decades, I would disappear. Instead, I was becoming clearer. Healing didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, in mornings where I woke without dread, in laughter that surprised me mid-sentence, in moments where Daniel crossed my mind and left just as quickly. I stopped replaying the funeral in my head, not because it stopped mattering, but because it no longer defined me. I defined it. About a year after everything happened, I attended another funeral. A neighbor's husband, natural causes, peaceful passing. I sat in the same kind of chapel, smelled the same lilies, heard the same hushed condolences. This time I noticed something. I was fully present, not braced, not scanning, not preparing myself for betrayal, just there. Grief without fear is a very different experience. On the drive home, I thought about the woman I had been standing in that first chapel, stunned watching her husband's hand brush another woman's sleeve. I wish I could reach back through time and say something to her, not to warn her, but to reassure her. You will not break. You will not lose yourself. This moment will not define your ending. People sometimes ask me now if I would have handled things differently, if I regret not confronting him publicly, if I regret not shouting, not exposing him sooner, not making a scene. I always answer the same way. No. Because dignity isn't silence, it's choice. I chose when to speak. I chose how to act. I chose myself. And that choice carried me farther than anger ever could. I still keep my mother's letters. Sometimes I read them when the house is quiet and the world feels heavy again. In one of the last notes, she wrote something I didn't understand at the time. Some truths only reveal themselves when we are forced to stand alone. Now I understand exactly what she meant. Standing alone isn't weakness. It's the moment you find out who you are when no one else is holding you upright. I don't know what Daniel tells people now. I don't need to. The story I live speaks louder than any explanation. And the woman who once watched her husband betray her beside a coffin now lives a life that no longer requires permission.
Time has a way of testing the truths we think we've learned. Months after everything settled, after the paperwork stopped arriving and the quiet felt familiar instead of sharp, I began to notice the subtler changes, the ones that don't announce themselves with relief or victory.
They arrive in ordinary moments, in how you respond when a door closes too loudly, in how you breathe when someone raises their voice, in how your body remembers what your mind insists it has moved past. I learned that healing isn't a straight road. It loops, it doubles back, it pauses unexpectedly at intersections you thought you'd already crossed. One evening I was cooking dinner, something simple, soup simmering slowly on the stove, when a familiar song came on the radio. It was an old one Daniel used to play on long drives. For a moment my chest tightened, not with longing, with recognition, a memory passing through, acknowledged and allowed to leave. I turned the volume down and kept stirring. That was new. Before, memories had demanded my attention. They'd grabbed at me like loose threads. Now, they were just visitors. I could greet them politely and let them go. I began to understand something else, too. The story people told about my marriage, what happened, who was wrong, who was hurt, wasn't the story I lived with every day. The story I lived with was quieter. It was about the choices we make when no one is watching, about the small compromises that feel harmless until they accumulate into something unrecognizable. I didn't blame myself for Daniel's choices, but I did take responsibility for my own silence in moments where I'd known something was off and chose peace over truth. That honesty wasn't self-punishment, it was self-respect. Owning your part doesn't excuse someone else's betrayal. It simply returns your power to you. I started writing again. Nothing grand, just notes in the margins of days, observations, questions, fragments of thought that didn't need to become anything else. Writing gave shape to what had lived inside me unspoken for too long. One entry read, "Grief sharpens honesty." Another, "Dignity is a boundary, not a performance." I didn't plan to share these words with anyone. They were for me, proof that I was listening to myself now. There was a moment, nearly 2 years after the funeral, when I saw Daniel unexpectedly. I was at the post office, standing in line with a package in my hands, when I noticed the shift in the room, the subtle way attention tilts when someone familiar enters. I turned, and there he was. He looked thinner, tired, not defeated, just stripped of certainty. Our eyes met. He nodded once, polite and cautious, like someone acknowledging a distant acquaintance. I nodded back. No anger rose, no urge to speak. The past stayed where it belonged. As he turned away, I felt something settle inside me. Closure doesn't always arrive with conversation. Sometimes it arrives with the absence of one. I went home that afternoon and sat in the garden, dirt under my fingernails, the sun warm against my shoulders. The roses had bloomed, yellow and open, just as my mother would have liked them. I cut a few and placed them in a vase on the kitchen table. The house felt lived in, not staged, not waiting. Mine. I thought again of that chapel, the weight of silence, the way grief had pressed on my ribs, the moment I saw the truth and didn't yet know what to do with it. That woman feels like a lifetime ago now, and also like someone I know intimately. I'm grateful to her. She didn't scream, she didn't collapse, she didn't disappear. She watched, she waited, she chose. If you're listening to this and you've ever been betrayed in a moment that should have been sacred, if someone used your grief as camouflage, know this: you are not weak for surviving quietly. You are not naive for trusting ones, and you are not obligated to perform your pain to justify your boundaries. Justice doesn't always come in the form of public reckoning. Sometimes it arrives as clarity, as distance, as a life rearranged to protect your peace. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy. I tell it because stories like mine are more common than people admit, because too many women are taught that endurance is the same as love, because too many people confuse forgiveness with permission. My mother used to say, "Pay attention to how people behave when they think you're at your weakest." That day in the chapel taught me everything I needed to know and everything I needed to become. I still light a candle for my mother on quiet evenings. I sit at the table and let the flame steady my thoughts. I thank her, not just for raising me, but for leaving me lessons strong enough to stand on when she couldn't stand beside me anymore. Loss takes many forms. So does strength. If you've stayed with me this long, I want to ask you something, gently, honestly. If someone showed you who they truly were at your most vulnerable moment, would you have done what I did, or would you have chosen a different path? There's no right answer, only the one that lets you sleep at night with your dignity intact. Thank you for listening to my story. If it spoke to you, if it reminded you of your own strength, I hope you'll stay a while longer. There are many stories like this, quiet, real, and worth telling.
Even now, when I walk through the streets of my neighborhood, I sometimes catch glimpses of the old life. The houses where Daniel's friends live, the park where we used to picnic. My heart no longer twists at the memory. Instead, it pulses steadily with awareness. I see things clearly now, not as they could have been, not as they should have been, but as they were and how I chose to respond. It's remarkable in a quiet way how much power a single decision can carry. I chose dignity. I chose clarity. I chose myself. And in choosing, I reclaimed the hours, the days, the moments that had once been borrowed from me by fear, deception, and betrayal. People often ask me if I ever think about revenge, if I feel the urge to make them pay. I can't lie. I considered it, briefly, but what I realized is this. The most devastating form of revenge isn't shouting or plotting or humiliating. It's living. It's waking up every day, noticing the sun on your skin, hearing birds, making meals that nourish you, tending a garden that flourishes because you chose it to flourish. It's showing up in the world fully without needing anyone's permission. That, I discovered, is more powerful than any spectacle could ever be. I began volunteering at a women's support group a few months after Daniel left. At first, it was awkward, hearing other women tell stories that mirrored my own, stories of betrayal, grief, hidden relationships, stirred old wounds I thought I had closed. But slowly, helping them find their own paths of dignity became part of my own healing. I listened, I nodded, I shared quietly. And each story I helped bear witness to reminded me that I was no longer alone, that my experience had value beyond my private pain. I realized that part of what my mother had wanted for me wasn't protection from grief, it was preparation. She had equipped me with patience, observation, and the courage to stand upright when the world tried to tilt me. That strength became not just a shield, but a bridge. I could help others cross over the chaos of betrayal and heartbreak without losing themselves. Daniel's absence shaped the final chapters of my marriage, but it didn't define them. What defined them was the discovery of my own resilience. I remember one morning, standing in the kitchen, sunlight pouring through the curtains, and noticing a small crack in one of the mugs on the counter, a cup Daniel had accidentally chipped years ago. It didn't bother me. In fact, it made me smile. I realized that life is full of imperfections, chipped mugs, broken promises, moments that should have gone differently. But it's in our response to those imperfections where real character emerges. I smiled and set the mug aside. Its flaw didn't diminish its usefulness. Neither did my husband's betrayal diminish my life. People also ask me what I would say to Lena if I saw her again. I don't need to say anything. Our roles were never meant to be reconciled. She was a symbol, a test of boundaries, a reflection of what I would not allow in my life. She was a lesson dressed in someone else's smile. In some ways, I'm grateful for her presence at that funeral.
If she hadn't been there, if he hadn't believed grief could be exploited, I might never have realized how much I had lost to complacency, how much dignity I had postponed in favor of peace. The funeral, once a scene of sharp betrayal, has become, in my memory, a turning point, a marker, a line I cross every time I remember who I am and what I will no longer tolerate. I also realize something about grief itself. We often think of grief as weakness or a burden, but grief can be a teacher. It's raw, unpolished, painful, but it cuts away what isn't essential, leaving you with a clearer sense of truth. That funeral taught me that truth comes in silence, in observation, in small acts of courage when you believe no one is watching. We talk a lot about revenge in these stories, about karma and poetic justice, but the quietest, most enduring justice is personal integrity. It's living in a way that can't be stolen from you no matter how others behave. It's carrying forward without bitterness, without needing applause, without waiting for validation. I've rebuilt routines, relationships, and rituals that belong to me now. I wake up early. I drink my coffee while the sun rises. I tend to my garden and allow the flowers to bloom without interference. I meet friends for lunch and laughter. I laugh freely, not cautiously. I write notes to myself. I read my mother's letters. I carry the lessons she left for me like a talisman, a compass pointing me toward the life she hoped I would live. I am careful, yes. I am protective, but I am also open to joy, to connection, to love of a different kind. Not the love that blinds, not the love that blinds, but love that strengthens, steadies, and frees. If you are listening to this story and feel the tremor of recognition, if someone has ever used your grief to manipulate, deceive, or control, know this: you are not powerless. You are not invisible. You are not weak. You have choices, even in moments of profound pain, even when betrayal is raw and unexpected. The power to reclaim your life lies within you. You do not need to scream. You do not need to explode. You do not need to bend yourself to the expectations of others. Quiet resolve, observation, and patience are weapons of the strongest kind. So I ask you, gently, if someone betrayed you in a moment that should have been sacred, what would you do? Would you collapse in outrage, or would you rise quietly, firmly, and live the life they tried to shadow? This story is not about me. It's about all of us who have faced betrayal, heartbreak, or deception at moments we least expected it. And it's about what we can become when we refuse to let those moments define our ending. I leave you with this reflection, and I mean it from the bottom of my heart. Grief sharpens truth, betrayal tests dignity, and life, even after its most shattering moments, can be lived fully, richly, and honestly if we allow ourselves to reclaim it. The woman who once watched her husband bring another woman to her mother's funeral now lives a life of intention, a life of quiet power, a life she chose entirely for herself. And so can you. If this story touched you, stayed with you, or reminded you of your own inner strength, I hope you'll stay and hear more. Subscribe, follow, and support these stories, because there are countless women and men navigating betrayal quietly, learning to rise. And there is power in witnessing, in sharing, in knowing you are not alone. Would you have done what I did, or would you have acted differently? Tell me in the comments. Share your story. Witness one another. Because in the end, dignity, strength, and love are what survive.